So there have been studies on links between periods where there's more solar flares and more wars are breaking out on the planet. There's a Russian scientist that figured this out in 1918. And the research done by Alexander Chevensky was validated by Raymond Wheeler from the University of Kansas, as well as Edward Dewey in the 1950s, who wrote his own book on solar cycles and their effect on the market and agriculture. So the effect of solar cycles is still something that a lot of people have never thought of, have never researched, even though many people know that they like to be around the sun, they like to be in sunny states, and they generally aren't really a big fan of when things get really dark and really cold and really wet. So this is one of my favorite topics, and for me it's one of the more enlightening topics as to how humanity is really being directed by cycles of the sun, and we see a rise and drop in what has actually been coined the human excitability factor. And during solar flares, and I've even witnessed this in my own life, in my own body, I've seen it in others over the years, since I started becoming aware of the issue, all human activity is heightened during solar maximum season, which lasts several years. It's not clockwork. It's not one big giant machine that has an exact beginning and end. It's not like, you know, the Gregorian calendar or anything like that. On average, it's every 11 years, and it varies, and every cycle varies in terms of its intensity. Let's get to the point of this video. Now I've covered some of that basic information, and I've talked more about the topic of the sun in other videos, and I'll talk more about it in the future. Human migratory patterns is something that I've been thinking about for years. We're talking about the concept of human beings, for whatever reason, having a sudden desire to move, to travel, to live in an entirely different state. And patterns where you're seeing many humans make that decision at the same time or around the same time. And what I truly feel is taking place, you know, in addition to, you know, things that are naturally going to happen in people's lives, you know, they're going to seek greater happiness. People are going to seek, you know, perhaps a better job or a better life for their families. I mean, those issues may be the issues in their mind, and they may be very well a part of the decision-making to move. But the other aspect that is, for the most part, completely overlooked by most of society, this is something that I myself have observed. I have not read any studies on the subject. It's something that I suspect myself is taking place. When we have more magnetic storms, where we see more solar flares or sunspots, there is an effect on human beings, even if we don't have the geomagnetic storms caused by the coronal mass ejections hitting the Earth. As electric beings, I think we're even affected by the sunspots even before they reach the Earth itself. And so what I'm seeing is a period of time, especially since 2009, 10, and 11, especially after 2011. Once this solar cycle started to become more active, there's also a major solar flare right before the Fukushima situation. Doesn't mean that HAARP wasn't involved. It just means that there was a solar flare that initially created that excess energy that may have been directed by HAARP that created the Fukushima situation. And so there's something going on with these solar flares affecting our Earth's magnetic field and thus human behavior being affected. I've mentioned several other things before in other videos and earlier in this video. Periods of war, periods of change, periods where human beings seem to be doing more drugs. I've also noticed every 11 years or so in Portland, there's record heroin overdoses. And so I'm looking at all this data, and to me, it's clear that human activity is heightened during solar flare season, which lasts several years. On average, every 11 years, we go through this period. And during this last couple of years, I've heard more talks of people going from Texas to Oregon to California to Texas to California to Oregon to other places. It's like we're being moved around. Now, what can be scientifically verified? That's not just theory. For people to think about, for people to contemplate, for people to consider, for people to ask themselves if this potentially has anything to do with human mass migratory patterns. And in 1992, you can look this up for yourself, a scientist discovered magnetite, microscopic magnetic particles in the human brain. And they were previously, in the 1960s and 70s, perhaps even earlier than that, discovered in birds, in fish, in other migratory animals other than humans that use the Earth's magnetic field as their compass. And so now that we have backed up with science in a New York Times article from 1992, although a lot of people don't even know about this, as human beings, we also have that installed in our biology. The magnetite in the brain tissue, the magnetite in the pineal gland of the human being, of the human biological computer. And now we know about magnetic north moving, on average 40 to 50 miles per year towards Siberia. We know there's changes in the Earth's magnetic field. We know there are other things in this galaxy or universe, or inner universe, inner space here around the Earth, where there are things impacting our Earth's magnetic field, or trying to penetrate it. The Earth magnetic field, by the way, being something that protects us from asteroids, meteor strikes, things of that nature. Things, for the most part, that could be damaging to humankind. So what is taking place with these mass movements of human beings and these solar flares? Have you noticed yourself this rise in sudden interest in moving? In periods where there's less people moving, periods where there's, say, more stability in the world, longer relationships, longer spans at certain jobs? I've noticed from my own life experiences, the periods where the most moving is being done are the periods in which the largest or most solar flares are taking place, or sunspots are taking place on the surface of the sun. And I've noticed in my life and other people's lives, the longest track record, work track record, and staying in the same geographical location is greater during the solar minimum period, the period in which there are the least amount of sunspots, the least amount of solar flares. That period would be, for example, 2004 to 2009, 2010. That 2003 to 4 to 2010 period to 2011, that is the solar minimum phase of the last cycle, with the maximum starting off in 2011, 2012. It's going to be a double peak this cycle, just like the last two, so we're going all the way to 2015. We won't hit solar minimum until about late 2015, 2016. So even though the future economy of the U.S. is unstable, and people will continue to prep, people will continue to prepare for those that want to avert a situation where they're basically without in a crisis, when the shit hits the fan, you're going to see a slight perception of things calming down for a few years. Even though we know in the greater picture of things, there's still all this stuff on the radar, but there will be a sense of calm in a few years, for a few years, even though all these other things will still be a reality. And it's the human biological effect to the solar minimum, just as there's a human biological effect to when there are more sunspots. And when there are more sunspots again, there are more coronal mass ejections. And some of those make their way to the Earth, creating the subsequent geomagnetic storms. And those geomagnetic storms, which can also cause the aurora borealis, directly impact human behavior, human consciousness, increases the human excitability factor. All human activity is heightened, and that microscopic magnetite in the human brain tissue, in the pineal gland, and perhaps other places in the human body, it affects us in ways that have never truly been openly, publicly discussed by the scientists of today, that act like they're cutting edge talking about quantum theory and quantum reality. But this is something that can be more easily measurable and demonstratable. No doubt about it, the powers that be don't want us looking at how we're affected by some of these more natural, celestial factors. And I think it's also important, before I close here, to reference that Russian scientist that discovered this link between world wars and solar flares, Alexander Chevensky, that he spent several decades in a Soviet gulag. He was punished by the oligarchy for publishing his findings because it threatened their worldview or their propaganda machine in their eyes, because he was providing a different explanation behind the Russian Revolution, which of course was a co-opted event, but he was drawing correlations between the increase in violence that he saw on the battlefield as a Russian soldier and the real-time observation of sunspots that he was doing through his telescope. For whatever reason, that got this man, Alexander Chevensky. You can find his Wikipedia page. You can find some info online. For whatever reason, the oligarchy of Russia at that time put him away for multiple decades. So the question is, what are we missing from this puzzle? Why aren't astronomers or people involved in astrology, for example, even looking at this? Or others in the conspiratorial movement? I'm out of breath. This was definitely quite a topic to address. I just want to get your take on this. Are you noticing the increase in humans packing up their stuff and moving? And can you yourself picture in your mind a link between the increase in solar flares, things being charged up, and the increase in people desiring to live in a different place? Leave your comment down below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.